Well, good evening and thank you for coming. I'm Henry Holmeyer, as you probably guessed. Um, Thank you for coming on a night when you could be in your gardens. It's a perfect temperature outside to be weeding or picking. For me, it's been a good garden year this year, and I'll put up a lot of food for the winter. And I love sharing the ideas that or the techniques that I've worked out over the years for putting up my garden. Because it's for me, it's not just about eating the food that's ready to eat today, this week, but I also want to be able to eat it in January, February, and March, and all the way through until next gardening season. And there are some vegetables that will last 8 or 9 months and still be just as good. So there are lots of different ways of putting things up or preserving your garden. Before I get into that, I want to mention that I've got 2 of my books here that will be for sale after the talk. The Vermont Gardener's Companion, and that's a little sort of mini encyclopedia about how to garden, and it covers everything from vegetables to flowers and trees and pests and diseases. It's got a little of everything in there. And then I have Organic Gardening, not just in the Northeast, a hands-on month-by-month guide. And this is a collection of the best of my articles over the last 10 years. And it's organized by the month, so you can see what I'm doing in my garden in general each month of the year. I also want to let you know that I do make house calls, that if you have a garden and you want some help with designing or dealing with problems or figuring out where to go with your garden for a very moderate price, I can come and visit your garden and give you advice. So let's talk about the vegetable garden. I would say that probably every day of the year, if I'm home and not traveling somewhere, I eat something out of my garden. And some of the things are real easy, like onions and garlic, which store very well. But I also put a lot of stuff in my freezer, and I dehydrate things. And I'm an old elementary school teacher, so I love share and tell. And so I brought a bunch of stuff here today to share with you, including my dehydrator and a couple of blanching pots. But I want to start by saying that it's important that you grow the things you really like to eat, because if you grow a lot of something and you want to be able to, you can store it well, but if you don't like it, there's no point in growing it. That's obvious. And you want to grow things that you can keep well or store well one way or another. And if you do that, you'll be real happy. You want to use your best vegetables for freezing or storing. You don't want to take beans that were woody and a little bit over the hill when you picked them. Freezing them won't make them any better. Canning them won't make them into dilly beans even. It's not going to make them better. You want to use your best vegetables for keeping for late consumption at a later date. The other thing is, and this is a tough one for me, sometimes I have the energy to go and pick beans, but I don't necessarily want to freeze them that night. But you really need to do it within the 24-hour period of when you pick something. Get it into the refrigerator right away if it's something like beans or broccoli. Tomatoes I don't refrigerate because they are less interesting to eat after they've been refrigerated. As you know, if you've ever bought a winter tomato and traveled from California to here. But getting them in, processing them right away is key. So tonight when I'm done with this, I'm going to go home and I've got 2 big gallon bags of green beans that I picked the day before yesterday. I didn't have the energy to do them that night. I was out that night and then didn't have the energy to do it yesterday. So tonight, no matter what, I'm gonna put up beans. I'm gonna put them in the freezer. Most vegetables have enzymes in them which promote the ripening of seeds and the general aging of the vegetable. And that's why we blanch things before we freeze them. We want to kill those enzymes so that they don't get woody and tough. Your green beans or your broccoli, in fact, many of your fresh vegetables aren't very interesting to eat once they've been frozen unless you blanch them. What do I mean by blanching? That means putting them in boiling water for a short period of time. So let me demonstrate what I mean. With my beans tonight, I'll fill this pot up, because I've got a lot of beans. I'll fill it up about halfway or more, bring that to a full boil with this inner pot inside it, so that's good and hot too. Then I'll dump in a bunch of green beans, and I will have taken off the stems and cut them in half. And I'll watch them, and they'll start to change color, and the water will start to come back to a boil. A lot of books tell you 3 minutes of cooking for blanching, but if you do that, your beans are mushy. They're fully cooked. And then when you cook them to eat them in January, they're really mushy. Certainly zucchinis and squashes have a terrible reputation as a frozen vegetable because people blanch them for 3 minutes and then they cook them and they're mush. So 60 seconds is what I do for almost everything except Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts are bigger and they're very dense, and I tend to cook them for 3 minutes. They seem to need it. But anything else, 60 to 90 seconds. And I actually sit there and watch the second hand go around. At that point, I lift up this part, let it drain. Then I'll put the lid under it. I'll walk it over to the kitchen sink, which is full of cold water, and I'll dump the beans or broccoli or the kale in the cold water. What I want to do is stop the cooking process. If you have a regular homeowner type stove, I have a commercial stove that really pumps out heat, so I can get this back to a boil very quickly. But if I didn't, I still wouldn't cook them for 3 minutes. Even if it hasn't come back to a rolling boil sometimes, I'll take it out and dump it. Kale, for example, if I have this full of kale, it might not get quite to a rolling boil. It doesn't matter. I can tell by looking at it that it's a different color of green. It's done its job. Get it into the cold water, and then leave it there. Some people put ice cubes in the water. I'm frugal, so I don't. And I'm lazy. I don't remember to make ice cube trays. I just cold water from the well is cold enough. I'll let it sit there for a while, and then I'll take the vegetable out. And this is a spin dryer. It's a lettuce dryer, but I use it for green beans. I use it for broccoli. It's got an inner basket, and it's got a little water in the bottom of this. I did some lettuce in it earlier and forgot to drain it well. I like this particular one. This is a Xylus brand because you can pull the string. I've had the kind that you push like this to spin, and if you've got a load of broccoli or Brussels sprouts or something heavy in there, it really doesn't spin very well. It doesn't spin very fast. But the string pull type is good. And there may be other brands besides Xylus, but that's the one I have and the one I like. Then, once I've spun it dry, on my countertop I put down a cotton tea towel, and I'll dump out the vegetables onto the tea towel. I'll take another dry, clean tea towel and I'll pat down the vegetables. You want to get them as dry as possible. Then I'll put them in a Ziploc bag, and it's important that you use freezer grade. There are 2 grades of Ziplocs, or any, the zipper bags. I'm not promoting Ziploc brand. It could be another brand, but there are storage bags and there are freezer bags. The freezer bags are twice as thick, twice as good, have double seals, and your vegetables will stay better. So they cost a little bit more, but it doesn't matter. You'll be happy. So here's a bag of tomatoes. I'm just using tomatoes because they're going to go in the freezer just like that. And I'm going to show you what I do to get the air out of the bag. I put a common drinking straw in, then I will get the seal all the way across. I'll arrange my fruit or vegetable in there. And while I'm sucking, and you can see that the bag is now clinging to the fruit. You don't need to buy a machine. There are machines that will heat seal your bag and suck the air out, but this will work just as well. So for $1, you can buy 100 of these straws, and they will last you for the rest of your life if you reuse them. So then I take a cookie sheet, I put my bags of vegetables on the cookie sheet and put it in the freezer. Now I have a number of full-size freezers because I eat out of my garden all year round. So what do I blanch and what don't I blanch? Let's start with what I don't blanch. Most fruits, apples and pears, are freeze just fine. And I'll say that with a caveat that they're very nice if you eat them within a year of freezing them. If you put apples in the freezer for use in apple pies and you lose them in the bottom of the freezer and you pick out a bag of apples that were dried 3 years before, they're probably not very interesting. You could make applesauce out of them. They wouldn't be unhealthy, but I think you lose some vitamins and nutrition if you leave things in the freezer too long. As a general rule, I like to eat everything within a year of freezing it. Yes?
Do you freeze them whole?
No, I slice them.
You slice them, okay.
I do. And I wanted to show you this little tool. This is a great tool. How many of you have one of these? Good. You just push it down over an apple or a pear, and it slices it into 10 pieces.
Peel or unpeeled?
This leaves the peel on. I also have a machine which I didn't bring, which it's an old New England tool that you turn and it slices and peels at the same time. So sometimes I peel apples, sometimes I don't. But I like this tool a lot, and I think there's a lot of nutrition in the skin, so I tend to want to eat the skins of things. So tomatoes I don't blanch. Apples and pears I don't blanch. Leeks. I grow a lot of leeks because they keep very well in the freezer. All I do is make sure they're good and clean. Then I cut off the top section to wherever it is I would eat it normally. Cut it in half and then chop it into small pieces, put them in Ziplocs, unblanched, and they store great. They really, you can make leek and potato soup all winter and into the next year, and it's just like they came out of the ground. Hot peppers. I don't blanch hot peppers or regular peppers. And I found that regular green bell peppers store very, very well in Ziploc bags in the freezer. In fact, last year, well, most years I don't grow green peppers because they'd really rather be growing in North Carolina or Mexico or someplace. I do grow hot peppers just because I love hot peppers, and even though I don't get great production many years, if we don't have a really hot summer, there are things that I can't get. But last year, I went over to Edgewater Farm in Plainfield and I bought a bushel of green peppers. If you are interested in putting up food and don't have a garden or don't have enough of what you really like, talk to a farm stand. And generally they'll sell you a bushel of tomatoes for $50. That's 50 pounds of tomatoes, $1 a pound. Peppers, I forget what they go, but compared to the price that you would buy if you buy 10 pounds of tomatoes, it's just a fraction. In other words, you have to do it at the right time. You talk to your people at the farm stand, And when they are ready and have a lot of extra tomatoes, they'll sell them to you very cheaply. And, you know, we have a lot of blights in our tomatoes these years. And it's, you know, I remember 25 years ago raising tomatoes, and the biggest problem was frost coming in middle of September and covering up the plants because they were still blooming and they had lots of leaves and they were producing great tomatoes, and they would keep on producing for another month if we didn't get frost. I'd be covering up with sheets at 6 o'clock at night. Nowadays, our tomatoes are done by now. All we have are some plants with just a few leaves on, most of us anyway, and tomatoes that are ripening on the vine, but they're not really growing anymore. The people that have hoop houses, or what they call high tunnels, really do very well, and they are able to keep out the various blights and funguses that make growing tomatoes so challenging for the average home gardener. So, I have been known on a bad year to go and buy a bushel of tomatoes to put them up. I think that's a better plan than eating tomatoes that come from California in the winter. So, if I freeze a tomato, what do I do with it later, you might ask? I freeze them whole. I get gallon bags, not this is a quart bag, but get a gallon bag, and I can fit 9 or 12 tomatoes, depending on the size, in the bag. I suck out the air, close it up, put it on a cookie sheet, freeze it whole. Then when I want to, in the winter, when I make a soup or a stew or a stir fry, I'll turn on the hot water in the sink, let it run, and I'll put my tomato under the running water, and then I'll just put it in my hands and rub it like this. The skin will come right off. I'll just set it aside for 5 minutes. Then I'll core it, take out where the attachment point is, and chop it with a big knife. And then I throw it right in the stir fryer or the stew. And if I let it thaw completely, it would be like a stewed tomato or a tomato that came out of a can. But generally, I just take them directly from the freezer and put them into the frying pan. Have any of you done that? It works really well. It's such a simple way to do it, and it saves a lot of time canning tomatoes. Berries, I don't blanch. Things, blueberries and blackberries, I grow. Raspberries, I just eat fresh because they're so wonderful. But I have a pretty big blackberry patch and some blueberries, and sometimes we pick blueberries at pick your own places. Blueberries are fabulous frozen. They're great. You can throw them in your breakfast cereal. Just take them out frozen, put them in the oatmeal or whatever you're having, and they'll thaw almost immediately. Oh, but going back to the green peppers, I never finished that story. So what do I do with a bushel of green peppers? I slice them, clean them, slice them, freeze them. What you can do is I learned this from Marguerite Tewksbury, who used to be an organic farmer in Windsor, Vermont. And she said, in the winter you take them out and you put it right in your salad. And by the time you actually get around to sitting down and eating the salad, they would have thawed because they're already sliced up. And they're still crispy. They're still nice. You know, if you let them sit for 2 hours, then they might get a little bit mushy. But I've used them in salads and been very happy with them. And then, of course, I cook with them. And the hot peppers, I tend not to freeze so much as dry, because then when I dry them, I can grind them up and make hot pepper powder, which I can then put a little or a lot into a dish depending on who I'm serving to. If it's just me, I'm going to make it pretty darn hot. If it's for company, then I wouldn't use so much hot pepper. But we'll talk about drying in a minute. Okay, so the basic blanching process of killing the enzymes, cooling them down, getting them dry, getting them in bags is pretty straightforward. So, what are the vegetables that I'm blanching? Let's see, beans, beets, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, carrots, cauliflower, though I rarely ever freeze cauliflower because it's so good fresh, but if I were trying to freeze some, I would blanch it. Corn, kale, sticker on my car that says "Eat more kale." It is so healthy, and it freezes so well. You know, a quick blanch in here, put it in a zipper bag. It is fabulous in anything. It keeps its character. Spinach goes mushy and Swiss chard. Lots of the green leaves go mushy when you blanch them and freeze them. But kale does not. It keeps its character. It's a terrific thing to stretch out a soup or a stew or a stir fry. Squash has a bad name for being mushy when frozen. I have one type of squash that I grow, which is of the zucchini type. It's called the Romanesco, and it's rigid. It has ridges. It's not rigid. It has ridges, and I slice it into half-inch cubes, blanch it for 60 seconds, and it's still crisp. It still has character, and it freezes great. So if you grow your own zucchinis, that's the one you want. And the nice thing about the Romanesco is that you can let it get big, to this size even, and it's not unpleasant. Other things that I freeze, I also freeze apple cider. I have a friend in Norwich, and I've been pruning her apple tree for many years, and each year I prune her tree in the spring, and then she gives me apples in the fall. And I bring them down to Paul Franklin at Riverview Farm stand in Plainfield on the River Road, and he'll press them in. He makes apple cider and sells it, and I'll bring down a few bushels of apples, and then he'll press my own apples and give me my own juice back, which is nice, because I know these apples haven't been sprayed. And then I have him process it into half-gallon jugs and ask him to leave this much space on the top, and then I put it right in the freezer. A half-gallon jug will fit on the door on those compartments of a stand-up freezer. And you want to leave that extra air so that it doesn't push the cap off. I learned that the hard way. And then the cider tastes just like fresh cider when you pull it out and thaw it. So what I usually do is, if I want cider, I'll take it out and I'll put it in the kitchen sink, fill up the sink with water, which helps it to thaw more quickly. That's how I thaw everything that I freeze, pretty much, is to put it either in a sink or in a big pot with water. If I'm in a hurry, I'll use hot water from the tap. But I don't like to thaw anything with a microwave. Well, I don't have a microwave, but I don't believe that thawing it with a microwave is the right way to do it. So you can either plan ahead or put it in water, and it'll thaw more quickly. Let's talk about dehydrating. I have a dozen or so cherry tomato plants every year. You might think to yourself, well, what in the world does he do with all those cherry tomatoes? I dehydrate them. This is called an Excalibur dehydrator, and I left it open here so you can see it. It's got 9 drawers, and each drawer will take 75 cherry tomatoes cut in half and put on there. And 2 of those drawers will fill up a quart Ziploc, and that's a quart of, so that's 150 little cherry tomatoes. And this, I didn't count it, but I'd say that these I'm going to freeze, and there are only 30 in there. So dehydrating really makes it take up a lot less space, and you don't have, things that have been dehydrated don't have to go in the freezer. They go in the cupboard. Yeah?
Do they essentially become like sun-dried tomatoes?
Yes, exactly. The sun-dried tomatoes you see at the store are just like what I do here. And you can also take a full-size tomato and slice it almost a ½ inch thick. If you cut them too thin, they're not substantial enough once they're dried. But between 3/8 and ½ inch of thickness on a full-size tomato. Though I don't tend to dry full-size tomatoes, I tend to freeze them whole. But this is fabulous, and what was it, last year was a fabulous year for apples. And we froze a lot of apples, but we also kept this machine running 24 hours a day for weeks, because dried apples are great snacks. They are really tasty. Dried pears are great snacks. We did a lot of pears. We had a great pear year last year too. Now this machine, there are two different types. This is the Excalibur. It's about a $300 machine. It has a thermostat, and it has a timer up to 24 hours, 26 hours. The thing that I really like about it is that the heating element and the fan are in back. So they're blowing out air across each tray, as opposed to every other dehydrator I've used, which has the heat element in the bottom, and the heat comes up through, so the fruit that's closest to the heating element in the fan dry out pretty quickly, and then the next row a little less quickly, and by the time you get to the top row, they've got moist air, and it's not so warm, and it takes a lot longer. So what the dryer I had for 10 years or so was made by a company called Nesco, Nesco, Nesco American Harvester. It's a nice machine. It serves me well. I still use it occasionally when I'm trying to run more than one machine. But what I had to keep doing was either rotating the trays, it's circular, and there's one with a heating element at the bottom and one with a heating element at the top. I like the one with the heating element on the bottom better, even though it's an older model. The one on the top, I mean, heat rises, so it's sort of counterintuitive to be forcing hot air down. I'm not sure what their design idea was, but anyway, the Nesco machines cost between $129 and $159. So this is twice as much, or more than twice as much, and I think it's worth it. And here's why. I mean, aside, even if I count my labor as not worth anything, I try not to, but, you know, that's, if you're putting up food, you have to sort of write off an awful lot of your labor and say, well, I'm not going to count that. This is 660 watts per hour, and the Nesco American Harvester is 1,000. So that's half again the amount of electricity per hour, and I run this for weeks. During the tomato and apple season, I'll run this 24 hours a day for 2-3 weeks. So there is a savings in terms of electricity. The other thing is that this has 9 trays, and I can get 75 cherry tomatoes on this tray. The Nesco American Harvester has a round tray, roughly the same size, but it's round and it has a hole in the middle for air to pass through, and I can only get 50 cherry tomatoes on a tray. So I'm getting, again, 50% more tomatoes on this one, and 50% less electricity. So, to me, assuming that this will last me the rest of my life, and I have no reason to think it won't, this is a good investment. So I do fruits, apples and pears, tomatoes. I've done carrots, and I did carrots as an experiment, but they actually, you know, if you want to see, if you have excess carrots and you want to store them to use during the winter, generally I just store them whole, cool in my cellar. But if you're going to do any hiking and you want to have sort of lightweight food to carry, they rehydrate very nicely in a stew or a soup or a stir fry. So I have a friend who also dehydrates zucchini. I haven't done that because zucchini is all water. It seems like there wouldn't be much left. But again, it depends how you slice it and what type you use. But it's a pretty versatile machine.
Do you need to use all the same kind of vegetable in it?
No, but you need to know how they dry. In other words, if I'm doing tomatoes and apples at the same time, apples dry faster than tomatoes. So I would set the timer, let's say, for 10 hours, check my apples, see if they're ready, take them out if they are, and then leave the tomatoes in for another, generally it takes about 18 to 20 hours to do a load of tomatoes. And this one in about 24 hours in the Nesco. Yes?
So how do you store them after you dehydrate?
I put them in Ziploc, suck out the air. Because I have a number of freezers, I usually have freezer space, and a lot of times I'll throw them in the freezer. They're gonna keep better there, but I've been known to put them on the shelf, and they're good for a year. I have on my shelf in the pantry, in a dark pantry, I have dried pears and apples just in glass jars, half-gallon jars with a tight lid. Yes?
Is the dehydrator noisy when it runs?
Let's plug it in and find out. We all have different definitions of noisy. But the answer is, you can hear the fan, it's got a fan.
It's right behind your second chair. Right in the
Yeah.
middle.
Oh, yeah. All right, let's crank this puppy up. Come on. All right, let's get over here. Oh, I have it on upside down. There we go. That's why I didn't want to cooperate.
Where does one purchase a dehydrator like that? Is it a matter of just going online?
Yes. Just go to Excalibur.com. And it's like anything else, you get used to it. When this runs all the time, it's in the kitchen, it doesn't keep me awake at night.
Is there anything that can be dried, air dried in a quick time?
Sure, if you live in Mexico or California, on the Mojave Desert, you can dry anything. I lived in Mali when I was director of the Peace Corps for that country, and that's in West Africa, and we used to dry mangoes just
nice.
on racks in the sun. Most American raisins are just sun-dried. In general, in the summer here, the humidity is fairly high. I don't think tomatoes would work. I think apples might. But I can't imagine, I've never been able to. Now, some people dry things in the oven.
What about typical herbs like parsley and rosemary?
They dry very nicely in there. Parsley is 1 or 2 hours, and it's just like the parsley you buy at the store. You can also freeze your parsley.
You know, and do you blanch that then?
No,
or not?
no. Just
Doesn't it turn black?
no, it's in
Mine
quite
does
freeze.
for some reason.
Huh.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I don't tend to do it, but because I tend to dry it in here and have it in the spice drawer.
Okay.
But I have, and of course basil, you can make pesto and freeze that. Another thing that you can do with tomatoes, and tomatoes are actually my favorite vegetable. I tend to eat tomatoes breakfast, lunch, and dinner at this time of year. I'm perfectly happy having a tomato sandwich for breakfast, or a BLT. You can oven roast tomatoes. You can cut tomatoes into sections of 1/2 inch or more and put them in a tray in a baking pan, put them in the oven, and roast them at 350 until they sort of caramelize and lose most of their water, but they also sweeten up. And then I take them out and they're not dried tomatoes, they're not, I don't know how to describe them, except that they've been roasted and partially dehydrated by roasting. I put them in a Ziploc, 1 layer thick, and then in the winter, when I don't have any fresh tomatoes and I want to eat a sandwich with a tomato, I'll take out a few slices of the roasted tomatoes, I'll put them in the toaster oven frozen. Put it on for just a few minutes and it'll thaw them and warm them up. Put them in a sandwich and they're great. They're a little chewy, they're quite sweet. Juicing is another thing to do, particularly with berries. And this is a jelly cone, is what it's called. But I'll cook up elderberries. I have this little stream. Elderberries like wet places. And I don't do it every year, but every now and then I'll pick a couple of 5-gallon pails or 1 5-gallon pail of elderberries. It's a good thing to do when you're having friends over for dinner. Because after dinner, people want to wash the dishes, and you say, oh, no, let's just sit down over here and chat. Oh, yeah, and we can pull the elderberries off the stems. And people love doing that. And I freeze them in zipper bags, but I also will make up an elderberry syrup. An old friend of mine who's no longer with us, Lewis Hill, who wrote 17 gardening books, and he was a Vermonter, lived to be about 90. He was a fabulous guy, born on a dairy farm back in the 30s, I guess, or the 20s, and only went through high school, and he wrote 17 fabulous gardening books. And he told me stories about elderberries preventing colds, that it was a great tonic for the winter to have a little shot of elderberry juice. So what I'll do is I'll boil up some elderberries and I'll put them in here, and then I use this cone to squeeze out the juice, and you keep all the pulp in there. And so I'll can in quart jars this syrup with, I usually add some honey to it, or some sugar, and so it's quite thick, and I have a little shot glass, and I'll fill that up with this elderberry syrup, and I'll take it in the morning as a preventive for colds. Now, I don't get colds, and I didn't before I started doing elderberries, but it's a nice, tasty little thing. And this is blackberries. I'll do the same thing. When I have a bonus blackberry year, I'll boil them up, and then put them in here and squeeze out the juice, and just can the juice in canning jars. All right, let's talk about the most efficient way of keeping vegetables, and that's just plain old cool storage. But you have to know whether to keep each vegetable, whether it should be in cool, high humidity or low humidity. So I have a cool basement that actually gets sometimes too cold, and in there I've built an area for storing potatoes, carrots, rutabagas, celeriac, basically root crops that want high humidity and cool temperatures. You want to store potatoes and carrots and these things that I mentioned between 33 and 50 degrees. If you have a warm, dry cellar with a furnace in it, it's not a good place for these things. If that's your situation, you need to buy a beer fridge. They're advertised in the Valley News from time to time, usually in the summer, people who have a second-hand refrigerator selling for $50 for people to put their beer, soda, and watermelons in. And you only use it in the summer. But if you put it in your basement and run in the winter instead, then you can store your root crops in there. Now, the problem is that modern refrigerators take the moisture out of the air in the refrigerator so that you don't have to defrost them. Some of you are my age or close to it and remember when you had to defrost refrigerators and freezers. Nowadays, they're all frost-free. How many of you remember when you had to defrost? Oh my goodness. This summer I saw an ad in the Valley News for a refrigerator that was an old GE. I called the lady up in Woodstock. It was made the year I was born, 1946, and it still runs. And I said, well, how much do you want for it? She said, well, I don't know. And I said, usually, when you have a fridge like this, you're looking for somebody to lug it away for free. Or maybe you pay them. She said, well, if you'd come and take it, use it, I'd be real happy. I said, I'd be real happy to have it because it's one of those that doesn't have the frost free. You know, it does get frosted up, but it had a good seal on it. The seal had been changed within the last 25 years. And so I can run it and store potatoes, carrots, beets. Beets are funny. They don't store well in what I call a cold cellar. You know, just in a bucket in a high humidity, low temperature cellar. But in the fridge, they'll keep fine. I'm not sure why that is. Same thing with carrots. I find carrots tend to get limp. If I just put them in a bucket in this one section of my basement, I just took cement blocks and made something that was 2 cement blocks high, 3 long, 2 wide, and had an insulated plywood lid. And it's tall enough that inside I can put a 5-gallon pail, the kind that sheetrock mud comes in. And so it's great for potatoes. You have to have a tight lid on, or the mice will want to get in there. Mice love potatoes. So you have to have a tight lid, and you don't want to ever let your potatoes freeze. You want to monitor it. If you have a cold space, like if you put this in your garage, some people have garages that don't really freeze, but when you get to 30 below or 20 below, a few days in January, you want to have a thermometer in there that you could, what I have is an indoor-outdoor thermometer, so that even in my basement it'll get below freezing in the very coldest days of winter. But I can check the temperature, and if it's going to get below freezing, I run a drop light in there with an incandescent bulb. An incandescent bulb will throw off enough heat to keep it above freezing. So an old refrigerator is a great thing to have for cool storage, and that's high humidity. A lot of times when I'm packing up my potatoes, I grow a lot of potatoes. I got some Irish in me. I'll put some clean sand in the bottom, and I'll put a little water in there. Not enough so that it's standing water, but just to moisten the sand. That'll add humidity to the potatoes that I'm putting in this cement block box in a plastic bucket, in plastic buckets. If you're going to store food, you want to check it often to make sure that you don't have one bad apple. You know, the same. Apples do store fairly well, but I've never had, I've heard of people who keep a whole barrel of apples and eat them all winter long, just keeping the barrel in the barn, and that's never worked for me. That's why I tend to freeze them or dehydrate them. Your winter squashes, like your Blue Hubbards, and really the best squash of all is the Waltham butternut. How many of you have grown and kept butternut squashes? They will last 9 months. I once had one, I think it went 11 months. And I cooked it and it was fine. They are amazing.
Just stored in a cool cellar.
But no, not in my cellar. I want to store them cool and dry. If you put them in the and I did this my first year, I had all these wonderful Blue Hubbards. And I put them down in the basement and they all rotted because it was too high humidity. So another old Vermonter, now long gone, told me the way you store winter squashes is you put them upstairs in the guest bedroom under the bed. Turn off the radiator, or turn down the thermostat if you have one, and you keep them around 50 degrees. And in the wintertime, that's very low humidity. That's what they like best.
So just paper bags or something? Or?
Paper bags or just laid out on newspapers. But again, you want to check them from time to time because you could get a rotten spot, and you don't want to have mush on your floor, particularly when the guests come and put their shoes under the bed and they find mushy squash there. Onions and garlic want to store 40 to 50 degrees, so they can be up there too, but it's convenient to keep a bunch of them in the kitchen. But the kitchen is probably a little too warm for the longest period of storage for storing onions. Usually I can keep onions very nice up until May or June from this year's crop. After that, they start to grow green sprouts. And the garlic, again, if it's cool, it won't start growing until later than if it's in the kitchen, then they'll tend to sprout a little bit. So what else? Canning. I'm not going to talk about canning because canning is something which has certain elements of risk, of botulism. And I think that you really want to read Joy of Cooking or another cookbook that really tells you, that gives you all the warnings, that tells you how to can tomatoes so that you don't get killed with botulism. In the old days, people got killed by botulism on a fairly regular basis. I do it, but quite frankly, if I'm making tomato sauce, it's a lot less trouble just to go ahead and make the sauce, and instead of putting it in the jars and then putting it in here for 40 minutes of boiling water, there's a lot of energy being consumed. Just transfer it into quart yogurt containers when it's cool, put it in the freezer. It looks great. So, I'm ready for questions. What's your favorite vegetable or fruit that you'd love to be able to eat all winter long? Anything I haven't covered? Yes, sir.
Corn on the cob, and what we've done with it is just put it in the freezer in the husk,
Really?
without doing anything to it
Huh.
whatsoever. And I've had very good luck in just taking it out and put it in the microwave, again, without husking it. And for
Fabulous.
I don't know, 2 minutes on each side.
Uh-huh.
Take it out, husk it, and it's
That's
been
great, I've
protected
never
with its
heard
own
that.
skin. And in fact, and that's how we prepare it when it's fresh as well. We don't husk it, we just cook it in its own skin, we don't black it or anything, but we find that works really well for us.
Thank you. You know, it's one of the great joys that I get from giving public talks is I always learn something new. What I do with corn is I'll pick a dozen, and then we'll eat 4, and the other 8 I'll take a sharp knife and I'll cut the kernels off, and then just put them in a Ziploc and freeze it.
Without doing it, just like that.
They've been cooked with, you know,
Oh, I see.
they've had 3 minutes of cooking.
Oh, I see.
If I were going to do, and I grew corn this year for the first time in 20 years. Somebody gave me a piece of land, allowed me, I've got a stripe up the middle of this farm field. It's 250 feet long and only 15 feet wide.
Wow.
And I'm growing corn and potatoes and sweet potatoes and lots of squash and hot peppers and dry beans and green beans. And I'm really having fun feeling like a little farmer. I call it our farmette. So I've got a tremendous corn crop. And now people say you can't grow organic corn because you'll have corn maggots and stuff. I've picked so much corn this year. Well, that's why everybody sprays. You go to any farm stand, they spray their corn against corn maggots 5 times a year. They'll spray it with 7, which is a toxic chemical. But I haven't done any spraying, and I have not seen one earworm or any kind of pest on my corn, and it's all perfect. And it's so much fun growing corn. I just love it. I should have worn my coveralls today, you know, with the bib overalls. Act like a farmer. Yes?
I've grown organic corn for several summers, and I found in 2 years in the same spot, I could get away with it, and then I started having bugs. And then I just switched it to another spot, and it's been fun.
And how far did you move it?
50 feet, just a new soil, you know, it's
Yep.
different soil,
Yep.
it's a different section of the garden.
That's nice.
So we'll see. But you said sweet potatoes.
Yes, sweet potatoes. I did last year for the first time. I bought 25 slips. And I talked to Gio Honinger, who I actually quote about how to do that in the Vermont Gardener's Companion. Because in each chapter, I interview somebody who's an expert in the, you know, in vegetables or perennials or trees or whatever it is I'm writing about in that chapter. And he said, you mound up your soil well, you plant, and you cover the mound with black plastic. Then when the time comes, you slice into the plastic and you plant in these little slips that look like, they're pretty pathetic looking. They have just a little hint of green on a little tiny bit of a leaf and a tiny bit of root. In a 30-foot row with 25 plants, I got 60 pounds of sweet potatoes. So this year I doubled because I had so much space. So this year I've got 50 plants. And here's the trick. I'm glad you asked about sweet potatoes because they don't store like anything else. They have to be stored warm. You can't put them in the cellar. They don't want to be below 70 degrees. They want to be in the kitchen. If you put them in your refrigerator, you'll ruin them.
Even in the kitchen, they grow pretty quickly. Do you keep them all winter?
I
mean,
do.
60 pounds of sweet potatoes.
Well, I actually was sharing, again, it was a piece of borrowed land. The trees have gotten so big around my vegetable plot, and I've cut some down, but I don't have as much space. And somebody, again, gave me a piece of land, and I grew there. So I gave the woman half the crop, 30 pounds of sweet potatoes, and I kept 30 pounds. And my hope is with this farmette that I can give food to the Haven and to the Claremont Soup Kitchen. And I've been sharing my corn with my neighbors, who now love me a lot more than they used to. At least they smile a lot more when they see me coming. I've got corn around, bags of corn. So anyway, yes, I've been able to store the sweet potatoes. I ate the last one in July from last year. And I was just keeping them between 60 and 70. But I have something I got from Gardener's Supply, which is what they call an orchard rack. It's a wooden frame that has drawers that pull out like this, but the clearance is about this much. And I used to put my onions and garlic and winter squash, my Waltham butternuts in there. Actually, the sweet potatoes I kept in a brown paper bag on top of that, or a couple of brown paper bags, and they kept fine.
But where in your house did you keep them? In a bedroom? Or
Right next to the mudroom. So in the winter, there was some coolness there's double glass doors. It's unheated out there. It's heated in here, but it's not real hot, which was good for the squashes and things. It might have been a little cool for the sweet potatoes, but a friend of mine had some that she kept all winter in her kitchen in a bag on top of something, and they were still good in the spring.
How do you blanch beets? You said something about blanching beets. Do you peel it first?
I don't do it very much because I don't grow a lot of beets, but the way that it's generally done is, yes, to peel actually you can put whole beets in boiling water and then take the skins off after they boiled for a while, and then you're basically cooking the beets the same way you would cook the beets. You cook them and then chop them up and put them in bags, and then you reheat them to use them in the winter. But I find that beets just left in the fridge tend to get a little slimy after a certain period of time. So I didn't grow beets this year, but next time I do it, I'll freeze them. I've done it before. Yes, sir.
Any tips on just growing regular white potatoes? You mentioned that you grow quite a few of them, and we've not had a great deal of success.
And what attributes the lack of success? Are you having trouble with potato beetles, or are you?
No, they just don't seem to produce, and I don't know if I'm not mounding them right, or this year it looks like they're having blight.
Well, they are susceptible to blight, but
in
you
years
do
past-
need to. What you have to remember is that where you plant the potato, the roots are going to go down, and the new potato is going to be above that wherever you plant it. So you want to make a deep enough hole You start off, what I use oftentimes is a post hole digger. And I can go right down the row, making holes about this deep, and then coming behind me, somebody will put the potatoes in the holes, and then cover it up with just a little bit of soil, let them start to grow, and then just push the soil in as they grow and get tall. And then this year,
At what point do you stop covering them? I mean, at what?
you can cover up the leaves and the stems quite a bit. You know, when the plant is this big, you can cover up this much of the base.
Okay.
I have a tool called a potato hoe, which is a 4-tine long-handled hoe, and I'll use that like a hoe to mount soil right over to make sure that there's plenty of room for those new potatoes. They like fertility, so if you give them some, I use ProGrow organic fertilizer, and that gives them some fertility. Other than that, I don't really have any hints. You know, every piece of ground is a little bit different. I have a friend who can take, I'll start onions, she'll start onions. She'll plant them at her place, and she'll get onions this size from the same type of onion that I'm getting them that are this size. You know, hers are twice as big, weigh twice as much. Why is that? It's a different soil. They're both full sun, both good soil, both get some ProGrow to start, but hers are bigger than mine. Go figure. Anybody else have a question? Well, thank you for coming out, and feel free to come up and thumb through my books and see if there's something here. The Vermont Gardener's Companion is $15, and this one is $17.50, and they're both great books.